Good morning, and those of you who follow my channel know that I've not been putting out much in the way of news or opinion pieces lately, and that's because, well, in effect I've been remodeling my office, so I've been stuck making videos on my phone. But I'm back in the office now, and you should hear that in my voice because I'm back using my proper mic, which is my Sennheiser E835S, and that's an XLR cardioid mic. And I'll put a link into that if you're interested, because it is a very good mic and it's definitely worth checking out. So if you're interested in that, go and click on the link. You'll be helping me out, and hopefully you'll be helping yourself out as well, because you will get yourself a decent mic. But anyway, less of that. Let's get on with the actual video itself. And as I've been away for a little while, I wanted to start with a bit of an overview, looking at the sort of state of play of what's been going on while I've been away. And there's been a lot of developments, specifically in relation to loot boxes, with Belgium ruling that loot boxes are indeed gambling, could have told them that, and that any game falling foul of their gambling laws will incur fines and even jail time. And as far as I'm concerned, that is a fantastic development. And we've got various other people looking now, and hopefully the EU will take this up as well. And I know my country are pulling out of the EU, but hopefully we'll start looking into it as well if the government pull their finger out. But that's not all that's going on, obviously. This ruling is very important, but it does relate directly to loot boxes. Now, obviously, loot boxes are something that's been big in the last year or so. They've been sort of bubbling under prior to that, but they became a big story with Star Wars Battlefront and Shadow of War and various other games as well. But obviously loot boxes are a sort of subset of the whole DLC thing, download content. And that's been something that's been growing and growing over the years as well. And I want to kind of have a look at this in a more general way. Within DLC, we've got season passes, microtransactions, loot boxes, and then allied to that as well, we've got the games of service model and also subscription models. If you look at it in the round, season passes came about first, really. We had I don't know if you remember the horse armor. We had the horse armor back in the day. And that was a little bit of DLC that was offered that you could pay for or not, as the case may be, and it didn't really affect the game. But that kind of didn't go very far for a little while, and we ended up with season passes, which I've never liked personally. I don't like season passes at all. It seems to me that you're paying up front for something that you don't know what you're getting. And that really came to a head for me with the game Hitman, which kind of had this season pass model but applied it to the whole game. Now obviously Hitman went on to be a good game, but the model I didn't like at all. And this idea of you could go and get the collector's edition, which had a statue and all the rest of it, but you didn't have the game in it, didn't sit well with me. This idea that you're paying up front and you don't really know what you're going to get. And we could have ended up with a pile of crap, to be honest. As it turned out, as I say, it was quite good, but you can't guarantee that for the future. So the whole season pass idea, you buy a game and then you spend another 30 quid on a season pass or whatever, as I say, never sat well with me. But then moving on from season passes, and I've already touched on it with the horse armor, we get microtransactions. Now, you got two different types of microtransaction, really. You've got cosmetic and you've got pay to win. Now, as far as I'm concerned, microtransactions can be tolerable if they're purely cosmetic, and if the customer can choose what item they get for their money, like with the horse armor. Don't like it, but if the companies want to make a little bit of extra money and people are prepared to pay for a small number of extras that don't affect gameplay and are purely cosmetic, then I don't have a huge problem with that. In this instance, you are getting an element of choice, and customers know what they're getting for their money. It's still not as good as when you won items for achieving something in the game, which is how it used to be done, and as far as I'm concerned, is a far superior way of doing things because it's integrated into game, but it isn't as bad as pay to win or loot boxes, because you are paying your money and you are getting something for the money, and you know exactly what that is. I think we need to be very, very clear about the distinction between microtransactions and loot boxes. If you look at it logically, all loot boxes are microtransactions, but not all microtransactions are loot boxes. And as I say, with the horse armour, with paying up front and getting something that you can see at the time of purchase, it's far less of a problem. Still a problem, but it's far less of a problem. But then we move on to loot boxes themselves. Now, I'm going to say this right now and up front. I agree with Belgium. Loot boxes are gambling, pure and simple. There's no argument to be had there. They are simply gambling. They add an element of chance to purchases, and that's what makes them so potentially addictive. And in my view, a complete waste of money because you don't know what you're getting. They're basically slot machines within a video game. I don't think they have any place whatsoever in video games, and certainly not in video games that are being sold to kids. And I know this isn't just an issue about kids either. There are plenty of vulnerable people who aren't kids. Loot boxes exist purely as a way to encourage you to spend more money, whether they're cosmetic, as in Overwatch, or they are pay to win. Now, cosmetic seemingly is better than pay to win, but in some ways, the cosmetic ones go under the radar. People don't get up in arms about them as much because, oh, wow, they're only cosmetic, but you're still spinning the wheel and you're still getting that little rush of hoping that you're going to get the thing you want. And that's the gambling element. It doesn't matter whether it's pay to win or not. That little rush is still there. And as I say, when it's pay to win, people get up in arms about it. When it's cosmetic, people are much more likely to argue and say, oh, it's fine. From a gameplay perspective, cosmetic items will always be preferable to anything that offers an element of pay to win. But as I say, people get sucked into it regardless. And in some ways, they're more likely to get sucked into it when it's cosmetic because of the argument I've already put, that it's something they can almost ignore and just spin the wheel when they feel like it, and they don't realise they're getting sucked in. As I say, this is gambling no matter what the ESA or anyone else says. And the gaming companies such as EA bloody well know it. Activision, Blizzard, they know it. They know exactly what they're doing. If you're defending loot boxes and you're a gamer, you need to stop kidding yourself. The industry paints them as offering a choice, but frankly, that's bullshit. I can think of no game, not a single one, where microtransactions improved the gaming experience, or where the game couldn't be improved if they were removed altogether. And we know that games like Shadow of War have been deliberately made more grindy to encourage more spending. And look what's happened now. Look what's happened as a result of the backlash and things like Belgium making these rulings. We now see Shadow of War are backing up. And why are they backing up? Because they know the writing's on the wall and they are going to be in big trouble if they don't. They've been forced into this. They would never, ever have done it unless we, as gamers, stood up and said, no, we're not having it. And forced it into the public eye and got something done about it. Well, hopefully in the future there will be more done about it, but we'll see. My personal view here is that I hope that loot boxes disappear altogether out of video games. I can't see it happening entirely, but there's more hope for me now than there was even, 6 weeks ago, even 2 weeks ago. Either way, you can bet, spin the wheel, that the gaming industry is looking for other ways to maximise profit. And I've already mentioned games as service and the subscription model. they're interesting because obviously in and of themselves they are not loot boxes, but they can tie in with loot boxes. I think that games as service models such as Microsoft's Game Pass and Sony's PlayStation Now potentially change the way gamers approach games. I've already heard people saying that issues with games with Sea of Thieves will be less of a problem for people who get the game via Xbox's Game Pass service. And I think that services like this do have the potential to make people far less critical of the games they play because they're not, shelling out a big sum up front. If you're paying £10 a month and you've got a whole raft of games and then they're releasing new games like Sea of Thieves onto it, the potential is there for you to be far less critical. And, I can already hear people in chat rooms and YouTube comments saying things like, "Oh, you're only paying $10 a month, so stop moaning, you tight arse." Well, that's all very well. And yeah, okay, there are other games you can play if you don't like that one. But nevertheless, you are still paying £10 a month and you still have that game that you are paying some money for. We could see a drop in quality as a result of this attitude. And I think this attitude could become more prevalent. People will just accept the games that are rolled out to them as they come out to them. And, sit there, crossing their fingers, hoping that the quality will improve as more content is dropped. Obviously, the flip side of that is that we could also see more innovation from small developers. So small developers who are in a position where they really can't find the money to develop the game they want to develop. Could it be in a situation where they have fewer financial risks to take? And because of that, because they're in the service, they've been offered a chance to go on the Game Pass service or the PlayStation Now service, if PlayStation Now ever implements something like that. Then they could have a guaranteed revenue stream, and that could make them more likely to make some obscure little game that appeals to a niche audience. And that's a good thing because we're going to get more and more developers coming online, and those developers could go on to be the big developers of the future. And I think that's a really good possible outcome from something like these games as service models. That's not to say, obviously, that Sea of Thieves itself isn't an interesting game. It is. But it's definitely not a finished product. And I do think that we'll see more games appearing in a similar state if Sea of Thieves is successful. And, actually, Sea of Thieves is quite successful because it's actually sold quite well. But we'll get to that in a minute. If these games are on the Game Pass service, then, they could still do well even if they're cut down. People have suggested that Sea of Thieves should have been early access, but the reality is that in a way it is. If you discount the people who bought it, and there were a lot more people who bought it than I would have thought, it's actually an early access game because we know that it's going to get more and more content as time goes on. I don't think it's a coincidence that Microsoft released the game onto Game Pass. And, the fact it's not a finished product doesn't surprise me in the least. To some degree, I wonder if Microsoft weren't testing the waters with this. It's certainly interesting to see how people are responding differently depending on whether they bought the game or whether they've acquired it through Game Pass. From a personal point of view, I've actually got it on Game Pass and I'm far less inclined to be critical of it personally than I would have been if I'd have gone out and bought it. That's just the way it is. And as I say, I wouldn't be at all surprised that that's the case with a lot of people. And if Xbox keep putting out content for the game and it gets better and better over time, that will keep people subscribing to Game Pass. Especially if other games come out and they have a similar model and you keep getting more and more content over time. The fact of the matter is that it's a guaranteed monthly income. and it's sustained by regular new releases, well, you would hope so in the future, and constant updates and improvements. That's the way this service model works. The problem, obviously, is if you look at something like Destiny, it can really fall flat on its face. Destiny 2 is having a bit of a time of it at the moment. But nevertheless, the games as service model, if you bring it into something like Game Pass with a monthly fee rather than an upfront fee for paying to buy a game, it's far less risky. And the fact is, as a gamer, I would rather see a model like that than a model that includes loot boxes and other ways to fleece us. Because I think it's a much fairer way of doing things. The two big problems there, obviously, are that games could still end up being little more than shells with very little innovation, or the Xbox and others are still tempted to use the model as a kind of gated entry. You pay your monthly fee, you get the basic game, but then you have to shell out extra cash on season passes, loot boxes, etc. So it could end up being the worst of both worlds, if you like. Nevertheless, if it can be held as a sustainable model, it's not such a bad idea. And it could be a way forward for the industry to keep making money without fleecing us. If we take Sea of Thieves as an example again, the fact is I think both these things are possible. Xbox have stated that all extra content for Sea of Thieves will be free of charge, but the fact of the matter is we don't know if it was always the intention to do that, or, well, if they were forced into it by what happened with Star Wars Battlefront 2 last year. And we also don't know if this will be the case moving forward as well. You know, we could find that games in the future do still include things like loot boxes. I honestly don't think that all games coming to Game Pass can have the issues that Sea of Thieves has had, and I think that Xbox will try to make future games more content rich on release, if you like. If they don't, they're going to risk that some people will lose interest with the service, and then if people lose interest with the service, they're not paying their monthly fee. After all, new games being released to the service is a big draw, but there's not much luster if those games are crap and they continue to disappoint. Having said that though, if Xbox continue to put out games that are successful enough and they keep drawing people in, then maybe they can just keep moving forward. As I think I've already mentioned, people join a gym and they pay their money every month, but how often do you see them walk through the door at the gym? People pay up and they just keep doing it, and it's not much money, so they don't care about it. What's almost more interesting, though, is the fact that despite the average reviews and the bad Metacritic scores, 69 from reviewers and 4.9 from users, Sea of Thieves has actually sold pretty well despite the lack of content. And it's actually second in the NPD sales chart for March, and it was only beaten out by Far Cry 5. So it's actually done quite well considering, which, as I say, surprises me. But anyway, that's an aside. As for the loot boxes, season passes and all the other stuff that the gaming industry has been trying to force down our throats, I think it could be very likely that these become more prevalent within the service model, as I've already said. It really does just come down to outlay. As I say, if you're paying a small fee every month, as well as the potential for being less critical of the content you're offered, you may also be less inclined to criticise extra costs. Gamers could easily be sucked into spending even more money than they do already on loot boxes and other DLC and microtransactions and all the rest of it. Don't get me wrong, I like Game Pass and I subscribe to it, but I do think we need to keep a close eye on it, because you can bet any money you like, ka-ching, Microsoft and others are looking at any way they can to maximise profit with the least amount of risk. And we already know just how much effort is going into research projects looking at ways of getting our money. EA are doing it, and we know that Activision are doing it as well. Of course, I could be completely wrong, and Microsoft might just be trying to create a sustainable model for the future that's both profitable and fair for the gaming public. After all, as I say, Sea of Thieves isn't a bad game, and if you get it as part of Game Pass, then, well, it could be a great game with more content. So we could just be experiencing teething problems for a completely different way of doing business. I hope so. But like you guys, I can imagine you guys are pretty skeptical, and so am I. I doubt that that's all Microsoft are doing, to be honest. And I can imagine that they, along with EA, Activision, all the rest of them, are actively seeking more ways that they can screw us out of more and more money. But with governments and legislative bodies now starting to take notice of loot boxes, they and the wider games as service model are going to be having an increasingly hard time over the next few months and years, hopefully. The recent rulings coming out of Belgium stating that loot boxes are gambling and talking about jail time for breaking rules on gambling law are, well, as I've already said, welcome. And if they set a precedent, then the whole money printing exercise could grind to a halt, and we could be back seeing games being actual games rather than vehicles for fleecing gamers out of their hard-earned cash. I can live in hope. But what about Sony and Nintendo in all this? I've obviously already mentioned Sony's service, PlayStation Now, and they'll probably make a big push to expand the service once the PS5 releases. And frankly, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some or all of the PlayStation 5 games being made available on PlayStation Now at the same time as their retail release, in much the same way as Xbox are doing it with things like Sea of Thieves on Game Pass. They could even offer some or all games early on the service, and that would drive people to the service. People love Sony's games currently, and if they put out something like The Last of Us 2 on PlayStation Now as an exclusive or even a timed exclusive, people are going to flock to PlayStation Now, even with some of the issues it's got. It may be too early for that, given the state of networking infrastructures in many countries, but, it wouldn't surprise me. And as I say, Sony's single-player games are great, and people want to play them. And also, crucially, they're less badly affected by lag than online games. So it's a possibility. We also know that companies like EA are looking at expanding services like Origin on the PC and EA Access on the Xbox, as well as moving towards a streaming model because, well, frankly, they've said as much in recent investor calls. So Sony aren't going to be backing away from PlayStation Now anytime soon. Far from it. Streaming services, whether we like them or not, are the future. And I think we're going to be seeing more of them sooner rather than later. And if the PS5 drops and it's discless, then you can bet Sony are going to be pushing hard. And PlayStation Now will be the way to consume your PlayStation games. I don't like it, but it's possible. As for Nintendo, well, who knows? All we can be certain of there is that they'll take the path less travelled. They're certainly well behind the curve when it comes to loot boxes and games as service and all the rest of it. But, is that a bad thing? I think not. The fact is that Nintendo fans are probably doing better than everyone else on this front. It could also be a good thing for Nintendo if the legislative bodies start dishing out fines or even jail terms for companies that breach gambling laws, because Nintendo are, to some extent at least, insulated from all that. There are games on their platform that do have loot boxes, but they're certainly not Nintendo games. So anyway, there you have it. go buy a Switch if you like games to be served up in the traditional way. But anyway, I suppose that's me done. Hopefully that one's interesting. It's just me trying to get my head around all these things. And maybe it's helped you get your head around them to some degree as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. And yeah, as I say, we'll have a chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and get myself a cup of tea because I've been going on for 26 minutes now? So yeah, I need to get a drink. And I'll speak to you in the next one. Bye.